From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Billionaire Warren Buffett thinks he should be paying higher taxes. President Barack Obama and many in Congress, especially Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, agree. Whitehouse has introduced a bill that would require millionaires to pay at least 30% of their income in taxes. To put that in perspective, wealthy GOP candidate for president Mitt Romney had about a 15% tax rate, less than most Americans. The idea may be popular for a lot of non-millionaires, but the increase in revenue would do little to address the country's massive deficit. That, plus health care in the Supreme Court and Campaign 2012. With our guest this week on Newsmakers, Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Good morning and happy Easter. I'm Tim White. Welcome to Newsmakers. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and political reporter for Rhode Island Public Radio, Ann Donis. Good morning, everyone.
Morning,
Senator, really good to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure to be back.
Let's start with the Buffett rule, or I believe the bill is called Paying a Fair Share Act.
Yep.
Okay. Estimates are that would only add $50 billion in revenue over 10 years, which would reduce the deficit by less than 1% over that time period. So, you know, the question is this really about deficits, or is this about what you perceive as a fairness issue?
I'd say it's about three things. First of all, it is about deficits. I think you've got to be pretty far away from reality to say that nearly $50 billion isn't real money. And we're only going to address the deficit by putting a lot of bricks together to solve it. And so you can't just be pulling each brick out saying that brick is too small. It's the package that's going to solve the deficit. And it's important that this be a part of that package for the very reason you said, Tim, which is that there's a huge fairness issue involved here. It makes absolutely no sense for Warren Buffett, who paid an 11% tax rate in 2010, to be paying a significantly lower tax rate than Mike Nunes, who is a truck driver here in Rhode Island. And it's not just Warren Buffett, although he's been kind enough to put his face and name to this cause. But if you go to the 400 highest earning Americans who earned over $250 million each, they paid on average an 18.2% tax rate. Guess what? That's what a single truck driver pays in Rhode Island. The year before, they had paid, I think, 14.8%, which was what a hospital orderly pays, pushing a trolley down the middle of Rhode Island Hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it is out of control. And the third thing that I think is important is that as I go around Rhode Island, I hear people increasingly fed up with the extent to which they think that Washington is controlled by the special interests. This is a chance for us to show that we can actually do the right thing. So I think as a signal that we're capable of doing the right thing, as a matter of simple tax fairness, and as a step towards our deficit, it's good across the board.
I'm pretty sure we don't have a lot of millionaire viewers of Newsmakers, so you probably have a lot of people at home, you know, liking what they hear right now. But, I mean, in all seriousness, isn't this really a dog and pony show? It seems very unlikely that anything of substance is going to get through Congress in a campaign year. There's little support for your bill in the House, so many feel that this bill is a political stunt.
I think that that would be wrong. I'm determined to get it passed. There are a number of ways to do it. The first thing is that when you've got a special interest that is at odds with the American people, usually the people supported by the special interest can take a punch or two, but eventually when the voice of the American public is heard loud and clear, they'll cave. So I think we have to keep after this. The second thing is that we are at some point, probably around the end of the year when the Bush tax cuts expire, going to do a comprehensive piece of tax legislation. What that bill is going to look like now, it's too early to say. But if we've made a good case for this, and the public has paid attention and realized it is unfair for them to be paying higher tax rates than a hedge fund billionaire, then we can make sure that that becomes a part of the final package.
Sticking with taxes, you were on Chris Hayes' program on MSNBC last weekend. I watched that, and he asked you about middle-class taxation, and I want to listen to the soundbite and then come back to it on that. Nick, if we can call that up.
Are Democrats at some point going to have to articulate a rationale for actually raising taxes, not just on the 400 richest taxpayers, but on the top 20% or the top 25% or the top 35%?
Well,
Perhaps. I hope not. I hope that between economic growth, the $1 trillion in spending cuts that we have already put into place or put into train to come into effect in the near future, that we'll be able to avoid that.
Sitting at home, that answer seemed kind of telling to me. Perhaps, I hope not. Isn't there really no way for Democrats to maintain the spending priorities they have without taxing people more who make under $250,000 as well? You know that. You're aware.
Well, the things that we've looked at in the Budget Committee as Democrats, and we've put together a package that is about $2 trillion in increased revenue. And if you look at some of the elements of it, obviously it's the repeal of the Bush tax cuts, particularly for over $500,000 a year incomes. It is, excuse me, getting rid of offshore tax havens. It's the end of the payroll tax holiday, which is going to happen naturally. And then the other big piece of it is reducing some of the individual tax deductions that people have. And you get there by reducing the tax deduction value by somewhere between 9 and 18%. So you're not getting rid of all tax deductions.
And just so people at home understand, that could be talking about the mortgage interest deduction, that could be talking about tax credits for college.
You'd be doing things like limiting the mortgage interest deduction to the first $750,000 or $1 million of value in a home, depending on the package you needed. You could be limiting the charitable deduction to what an average American pays in taxes. So if you're at a high-end rate, you're not getting more benefit for your charitable deduction than if you're a middle-income person. So none of this would be a really brutal strike against those basic American deductions, but if you can reduce them by between 9 and 18%, you get to where we are without having to raise baseline taxes.
And of course we don't know that, though, because the Senate Democrats haven't passed a budget in something like 1,000 days, right?
Well, actually, we not only passed a budget, we put it into law. It's called the Budget Control Act, and it covers last year and this year. And
deal.
Exactly. So we are operating under a budget that is not only a matter of budget policy, but it's actually a matter of law, signed into law by the President of the United States.
Senator, you're a polar political opposite from people like Grover Norquist, who's talked about reducing the federal budget to the size where it can be strangled in the bathtub. But is Norquist right to say that the federal government is just too big and that you have to avoid tax increases to reduce the size of the federal government?
I think there probably are places in which you could reduce the size of the federal government. Clearly, we're going to reduce the size of the defense establishment as we complete the withdrawal from Iraq, draw down in Afghanistan, and begin to have to spend less on the defense contractors who are supporting those wars. We could save an immense amount of money in the federal health care budget if we took a really serious run at the excess and unnecessary costs in our health care system, which very responsible studies from a whole variety of sides have estimated it being between $700 billion and $1 trillion a year. So if you can save that kind of money by providing better care, which, by the way, is a place where Rhode Island is doing very well. We can be very proud of what Elizabeth Roberts is doing with the Insurance Exchange, what the Rhode Island Quality Institute is doing with electronic infrastructure and with quality improvement, reducing infections in our intensive care units, which cost nationally like $2.5 billion a year. You save that money by avoiding the infection. So there are significant things that we can do to lower the cost of government and make it work better. But it does not require us to throw people off Social Security, does not require us to privatize it. It does not require us to cut Medicare benefits for seniors. There's some things that does not require us to cut Pell Grants. There's some things that I think there's an ulterior motive in going after them on the Republican side.
The Tea Party folks like to talk about taxes being too high, but the federal taxes paid by most Americans, particularly the wealthy, are lower than they have been in decades. Have Democrats effectively communicated the real picture?
No. No.
Why not?
No. I think we're probably a little bit less good at propagandizing than the other side, but I think it's a recurring issue. I mean, go back to health care for a minute. The 45 provisions of the health care bill that are designed to make care better for all of us and lower cost by doing so are virtually unknown to the public.
Oh, you have a new report
and
on
yet,
those, right?
Exactly. Well, I'm trying to get the word out on it because it's important. This is the path for reform for our healthcare system that's going to save all that money. On the other hand, a significant number of seniors actually believe that there is a death panel in the healthcare bill. There isn't. It was imaginary. It was created by spin artists on the other side, but people came to believe it because when you hear things enough, it begins to sink in.
Senator, I want to talk about healthcare. I want to talk about the Supreme Court. Let's just round up the tax conversation if we could. On a personal note, financial disclosure reports indicate that you're a millionaire in terms of worth, but not necessarily annual income, which is what your bill would tax.
Correct.
It doesn't appear that, in reading the disclosure reform, and correct me if I'm wrong, that this bill would affect you. Do you know if your taxes would increase under the Buffett rule?
The people for whom taxes increase under the Buffett rule are people who earn over $1 million a year, up to $2 million a year, at which point it kicks in completely, and then $2 million and up. There's like a phase in between $1 million and $2 million a year in income.
Is that you?
No, never.
So people might say, listening, here's a millionaire whose bill that he's proposing and is pounding the desk over, it wouldn't affect him. And they would say, gee, that's not fair. How would you respond?
Well, I think my Senate salary is public. It's $160,000 a year. If you reduce the amount that is taxed under this proposal down to $160,000 a year, now you're sweeping up middle-class families. You've completely mistargeted the purpose of this exercise, which is to get after the people who are making not just millions, but often tens of millions and even hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and yet are paying lower tax rates than regular folks. I don't pay an 11% tax rate. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but I can tell you.
I was just going to ask you that, if you knew what your tax rate was last year.
It's considerably more than that. I don't know what it is, but I'm not in that category of people earning 11% and paying 11% and 14%.
And it's hard
rates.
for those of us who do make millions a year, to calculate our taxes. I want to turn to healthcare. Tim mentioned that. The Affordable Care Act, we've been talking a lot about what the Supreme Court's going to do. I want to actually start with a different question. You said on that same program that the Democrats never loved the idea of an individual mandate. President Obama campaigned against it. Do you think the Affordable Care Act will work without an individual mandate if just that section of the bill is carved out by the court?
If just that section of the bill is carved out by the court, then the insurance industry is going to have to do one of two things. It's going to have to go to the states where their rates are set and either raise their rates to offset the cost of the kids with pre-existing conditions who they have to cover, or they're going to have to go to the states and say, like Massachusetts, we need a mandate. And the thing about the mandate discussion is that it is 100% absolutely indisputably constitutional for there to be an individual mandate at the state level. The question is whether this is a state power or a power that the federal government also shares.
But isn't
so if
that
they do that, that solves the problem right away.
Why not call it a tax then? We wouldn't be in this mess if we had called it a tax over a mandate, isn't that correct?
Rather than a penalty.
Excuse me, a penalty. Yeah.
We perhaps should have, but I think that at the time, and really up to the Supreme Court arguments, nobody really felt that these arguments had much traction. There were polls taken of constitutional scholars around the country, and there was something like 85% said that's clearly constitutional. It's only when those 5 conservative justices on the court started asking questions about broccoli and things like that during the debates that people sat back and said, wait a minute, they might actually do this. Now, I hope they won't. I think they won't. But they might actually do this, and I think that has popped it up a lot more. I think if people thought it was more credible, you might as well have called it that, because it is important that we protect families from all of the problems that the healthcare system causes, like, whether it's Olive in Woonsocket and her husband who has Alzheimer's, and when they fall in the donut hole, they're devastated, but we're closing the donut hole because of this, to Will and his dad Greg, who has cystic fibrosis, the son, and he's 16 years old, and You know, he's going to face lifetime caps, and his dad's not going to be able to move jobs because the son will be uninsurable. So I mean, you have to solve those problems. Those are simply unacceptable things for our society.
And yet there was a CBS New York Times poll last month that found that almost half of Americans disapprove of the Democratic healthcare reform law. If it's such good law, why do...
Well, interesting on that, because it depends what you call it. If you say, do you approve of Obamacare or the healthcare reform, then it's, I think, kind of about 50-50. When you say, do you approve of kids with pre-existing conditions getting coverage no matter what?
That's push polling, though, is what we call that in the industry.
But that's actually what the bill does.
Okay.
You know? And so when people actually look at what the bill does in real life, that's the only part that isn't popular. The other parts are extremely popular. But it's been branded, back to your earlier discussion about how some people are better at branding things and doing public relations than others. It's been branded as something bad, and if you just turn people's attention to the brand, then it's much less popular than if you turn their attention to what it actually does in real life for real people like Olive and like Ryan, age 2, and like Greg and Will.
I want to keep the conversation here, and I want to pick your brain a little bit on the Supreme Court. We have to take a break right now. Our guest is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, Ian Donis, Ted Nesi. Our guest this week is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Senator, before we went to the break, we were talking about health care, Supreme Court. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell this week told the president to back off after the president made comments that it would be extraordinary if the courts overturned the health care bill. McConnell said, quote, "The independence of the court must be defended." Do you disagree with him?
I do not think that it is a challenge to the independence of the court for the President of the United States, who has his own independent responsibility to protect and defend the Constitution, to say that a decision that threw out the health care law over an individual mandate is new, different, and extreme. I think that is just discussion of an important public issue. And it comes as a little bit of an irony that the Republican Party, which has spent a generation attacking the court and quarreling over activist judges, suddenly now has decided that, oh no, you can't criticize judges any longer. You can't even discuss what they're talking about or offer your own independent assessment of whether it would be extreme or not. I happen to agree with the president. I think it would be a new leap by the court outside of precedent, and in a way that I think could fairly be seen as an activist step to take down a bill of this breadth over the requirement of an individual mandate that is indisputably constitutional at the state level, and that frankly for its entire life until it got into this bill was always the Republican idea.
An activist step. So are you saying you think the Supreme Court is a political body?
I think that they've made decisions that are pretty hard to justify, and the one that is the most flagrant, well, two, I suppose, the Bush versus Gore election decision, but more recently, and I think more damaging, is the Citizens United decision. I think to unleash into American elections unlimited corporate money, anonymous unlimited corporate money, as we've seen through the super PACs, has not helped the public debate, has degraded the public debate, has drowned out regular voices, and has allowed a select little group of billionaires to have extraordinary control over what candidates remain in, what candidates go out, what they say while they're candidates. It is a long way from the kind of American democracy that Thomas Jefferson had in mind.
We should note that Citizens United also expanded the ability of unions to make those same kinds of political contributions. But let me ask you about that.
And I'd put the unions in exactly the same position as everybody else. I think you shouldn't be able to spend that kind of money unregulated and anonymously in our elections.
Let's talk a little bit more about campaign finance. Democrats like you are very critical of the Citizens United decision. You have a huge financial advantage over your Republican rival Barry Hinckley this year. Would you be willing to compete on an equal financial footing as Barry Hinckley?
Well, the question is, an equal financial footing with whom?
Barry Hinckley.
Barry Hinckley.
Yeah, but is that really where this race ends up? I mean, you have these huge super PACs that are out there. Karl Rove is raising hundreds of millions of dollars. They can choose to spend that money wherever they want.
Do you think they'll target you?
I think if I look vulnerable, they would. I think they're going to look for anybody who looks vulnerable. They have virtually unlimited money. This guy who is the billionaire from the gambling casino in Macau, evidently that gambling casino makes more money than all of Las Vegas does. So what's money to him? If Karl Rove gets on the phone and says, we've got, a race in Rhode Island that, this guy's annoyed us, he stood up against Citizens United, he stood up against the banks, he's been after the hedge fund billionaires tax loophole, let's teach him a lesson.
But your bill doesn't address
I gotta
that.
be prepared.
I mean, your bill makes it more transparent, so you can find out, within 24 hours who spent more than $10,000. But it doesn't address what you're complaining about here, which is the guy with the fattest wallet wins.
That's because the Supreme Court has said that that's a matter of constitutional law, so we can't address that until the Supreme Court corrects it, which I hope they will, or until we pass a constitutional amendment to repair it, which I hope we will. But in the meantime, at least it gives a candidate a fighting chance to be able to point out to the public, oh, by the way, that $3 million of dirty smear advertisements that just got dropped on me, that is brought to you by ExxonMobil. And I've been fighting on climate change. That is brought to you by this mysterious hedge fund from New York. And I've been fighting for their taxes to be equal to the package truck delivery drivers' taxes. And you've got a fighting chance at that point to make your case and explain the motives of the other side. So it's a step in the right direction. Does it fix it? No. That's the problem with the Supreme Court decision being based in their view of the Constitution, which we can't by law change that. We have to do that by amendment.
Sticking with politics, first, just a quick one. As we said, your Republican opponent looks like it will be Barry Hinckley. Will you debate him?
I'm sure.
Okay.
I can't imagine not. It's pretty standard procedure.
Okay. Well, sometimes incumbents try to duck it, so we'll remember that later this year that you told us. Also, your Senate seat was Lincoln Chafee's till he lost in 2006. Yeah. We talked about this once before. Now he's endorsing you. How do you think he's doing as governor?
I think he's doing better than the public polling suggests. I think he's been brave about doing some of the things that he ran on. He said that he was going to fight to have kids have access to University of Rhode Island and our state schools at the in-state rate, even if they didn't have their papers in order, as long as they were children when they came into the country. And he's delivered on that. I think he fought very hard, along with Treasurer Raimondo, on the pension issues, and is continuing the fight at the municipal pension level. And I think as he more finds his footing and gets his message out better and continues to do the things that he's working on, I think you may very well see his numbers improve. He's very good to work with, and his administration tries very hard. They've had big victories, like the huge Race to the Top grant for the preschool early education program that they put together. So
would you welcome him to the Democratic Party?
His decision whether or not to come.
Another political question. Your fellow members of the Democratic establishment are rallying behind Congressman David Cicilline as he faces what looks like a tough re-election fight. Some voters are troubled by how Cicilline said Providence was in good financial condition as he was running for Congress, and as we know, Providence is very troubled financially right now. Is Cicilline's seemingly less than accurate description of Providence's fiscal condition a reason to vote against him?
Well, I think as you get closer to this race, I hope that two things will become clear. One is that we could very well have the balance of the House of Representatives be at play. And if we lost the Rhode Island seat and we went back to Speaker Boehner and the Ryan budget and the end of Medicare as we know it in 10 years, and massive cuts to social programs and $150,000 additional tax benefits to billionaires versus
Senator,
a more fruit roll,
are you saying that partisan politics trumps honesty?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that when you have a fight for the future of the country, that is an important issue as well. And I think if you go back and look at David's record as mayor, there's a lot that happened that was really good in Providence during his time, and I think he has time between now and then to bring out the complete story, whether it's in law enforcement or in education, race to the top, or in just simply cleaning things up from his predecessor. You'll recall that he inherited a city that was a ongoing criminal enterprise.
Senator, we have 30 seconds.
We lost Peter Lord this week, the Providence Journal's longtime environmental reporter, who was a mentor to me and many other young reporters. Your memories of him?
It's a really tough loss. Peter was one of the most decent guys out there. He usually knew more about what he was talking about than the person that he was interviewing, but he never used that to, all he wanted to do was to get the story out right. He was one of the most principled, kind, talented people I've ever come across in the media, and it's just terribly sad.
Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, thank you for joining us on the program. For Ian Donis and Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. Happy Easter, and we'll see you next week on Newsmakers.